John should find home a paradise. She'd always see a smiling face. She'd fare sumptuously every day, and never know the loss of a button. She brought so much love, energy, and cheerfulness to the work that she could not but succeed, in spite of some obstacles. Her paradise was not a tranquil one, for the little woman fussed, was over-anxious to please, and bustled about like a true Martha, cumbered with many cares. She was too tired sometimes even to smile. John grew dyspeptic after a course of dainty dishes, and ungratefully demanded plain fare. As for buttons, she soon learned to wonder where they went, to shake her head over the carelessness of men, and to threaten to make him sew them on himself, and see if his work would stand impatient and clumsy fingers any better than hers. They were very happy, even after they discovered that they couldn't live on love alone. John did not find Meg's beauty diminished, though she beamed at him from behind the familiar coffee pot. Nor did Meg miss any of the romance from the daily parting, when her husband followed up his kiss with the tender inquiry, "Shall I send some veal or mutton for dinner, darling?" The little house ceased to be a glorified bower, but it became a home, and the young couple soon felt that it was a change for the better. At first they played keep house, and frolicked over it like children. Then John took steadily to business, feeling the cares of the head of a family upon his shoulders, and Meg laid by her cambric wrappers, put on a big apron, and fell to work, as before said, with more energy than discretion. While the cooking mania lasted, she went through Mrs. Cornelius's recipe book, as if it were a mathematical exercise, working out the problems with patience and care. Sometimes her family were invited to help eat up a 2 bounteous feast of success, or Lottie would be privately dispatched with a batch of failures, which were to be concealed from all eyes in the convenient stomachs of the little Hummels. An evening with John over the account books usually produced a temporary lull in the culinary enthusiasm, and a frugal fit would ensue, during which the poor man was put through a course of bread pudding, hash, and warmed over coffee, which dried his soul, although he bore it with praiseworthy fortitude. Before the golden mean was found, however, Meg added to her domestic possessions what young couples seldom get on long without, a family jar. Fired with a housewifely wish to see her storeroom stocked with homemade preserves, she undertook to put up her own currant jelly. John was requested to order home a dozen or so of little pots and an extra quantity of sugar, for her own currants were ripe and were to be attended to at once. As John firmly believed that my wife was equal to anything, and took a natural pride in her skill, he resolved that she should be gratified, and their only crop of fruit laid by in a most pleasing form for winter use. Home came 4 dozen delightful little pots, half a barrel of sugar, and a small boy to pick the currants for her. With her pretty hair tucked into a little cap, arms bared to the elbow, and a checked apron which had a coquettish look in spite of the bib, the young housewife fell to work, feeling no doubts about her success, for hadn't she seen Hannah do it hundreds of times? The array of pots rather amazed her at first, but John was so fond of jelly, and the nice little jars would look so well on the top shelf, that Meg resolved to fill them all, and spent a long day picking, boiling, straining, and fussing over her jelly. She did her best. She asked advice of Mrs. Cornelius. She racked her brain to remember what Hannah did that she had left undone. She reboiled, resugared, and restrained, but that dreadful stuff wouldn't gel. She longed to run home, bib and all, and ask Mother to lend her a hand, but John and she had agreed that they would never annoy anyone with their private worries, experiments, or quarrels. disastrous one. But they had held to their resolve, and whenever they could get on without help, they did so, and no one interfered, for Mrs. March had advised the plan. So Meg wrestled alone with the refractory sweetmeats all that hot summer day, and at 5 o'clock sat down in her topsy-turvy kitchen, wrung her bedaubed hands, lifted up her voice, and wept. Now, in the first flush of the new life, she had often said, "My husband shall always feel free to bring a friend home whenever he likes. I shall always be prepared. There should be no flurry, no scolding, no discomfort, but a neat house, a cheerful wife, and a good dinner. John, dear, never stop to ask my leave. Invite whom you please, and be sure of a welcome from me." How charming that was, to be sure. John quite glowed with pride to hear her say it, and felt what a blessed thing it was to have a superior wife. But although they had had company from time to time, it never happened to be unexpected, and Meg had never had an opportunity to distinguish herself till now. It always happens so in this vale of tears. There is an inevitability about such things, which we can only wonder at, deplore, and bear as best we can. If John had not forgotten all about the jelly, it really would have been unpardonable in him to choose that day, of all the days in the year, to bring a friend home to dinner unexpectedly. Congratulating himself that a handsome repast had been ordered that morning, feeling sure that it would be ready to the minute, and indulging in pleasant anticipations of the charming effect it would produce when his pretty wife came running out to meet him, he escorted his friend to his mansion with the irrepressible satisfaction of a young host and husband. It is a world of disappointments, as John discovered when he reached the Dovecote. The front door usually stood hospitably open. Now it was not only shut, but locked, and yesterday's mud still adorned the steps. The parlour windows were closed and curtained. No picture of the pretty wife sewing on the piazza, in white, with a distracting little bow on her hair, or a bright-eyed hostess, smiling a shy welcome as she greeted her guest. Nothing of the sort, for not a soul appeared but a sanguinary-looking boy asleep under the currant bushes. "I'm afraid something has happened. Step into the garden, Scott, while I look up Mrs. Brooke," said John, alarmed at the silence and solitude. Round the house he hurried, led by a pungent smell of burnt sugar, and Mr. Scott strolled after him with a queer look on his face. He paused discreetly at a distance when Brooke disappeared, but he could both see and hear, and, being a bachelor, enjoyed the prospect mightily. In the kitchen reigned confusion and despair. One edition of jelly was trickled from pot to pot, another lay upon the floor, and a third was burning gaily on the stove. Lottie, with Teutonic phlegm, was calmly eating bread and currant wine, for the jelly was still in a hopelessly liquid state, while Mrs. Brooke, with her apron over her head, sat sobbing dismally. "My dearest girl, what is the matter?" cried John, rushing in with awful visions of scalded hands, or sudden news of affliction, and secret consternation at the thought of the guest in the garden. "Oh, John, I am so tired and hot and cross and worried. I've been at it till I'm all worn out. Do come and help me, or I shall die." And the exhausted housewife cast herself upon his breast, giving him a sweet welcome in every sense of the word, for her pinafore had been baptized at the same time as the floor. "What worries you, dear? Has anything dreadful happened?" asked the anxious John, tenderly kissing the crown of the little cap, which was all askew. "Yes," sobbed Meg despairingly. "Tell me quick then. Don't cry. I can bear anything better than that. Out with it, love. The jelly won't gel, and I don't know what to do." John Brooke laughed then, as he never dared to laugh afterward, and the derisive Scott smiled involuntarily as he heard the hearty peal, which put the finishing stroke to poor Meg's woe. heaven's sake, don't have hysterics, for I've brought Jack Scott home to dinner and—" John got no further, for Meg cast him off and clasped her hands with a tragic gesture as she fell into a chair, exclaiming, in a tone of mingled indignation, reproach, and dismay, "A man to dinner, and everything in a mess. John Brooke, how could you do such a thing?" "Hush, he's in the garden. I forgot the confounded jelly, but it can't be helped now," said John, surveying the prospect with an anxious eye. "You ought to have sent word, or told me this morning, and you ought to have remembered how busy I was," continued Meg, petulantly, for even turtle doves will peck when ruffled. "I didn't know it this morning, and there was no time to send word, for I met him on the way out. I never thought of asking leave, when you have always told me to do as I liked. I never tried it before, and hang me if I ever do again," added John, with an aggrieved air. "I should hope not. Take him away at once. I can't see him, and there isn't any dinner." "Well, I like that. Where's the beef and vegetables I sent home, and the puddings that you promised?" cried John, rushing to the larder. "I hadn't time to cook anything. I meant to dine at Mother's. I'm sorry, but I was so busy," and Meg's tears began again. John was a mild man, but he was a human, and after a long day's work, to come home tired, hungry, and hopeful, to find a chaotic house, an empty table, and a cross wife, was not exactly conducive to repose of mind or manner. He restrained himself, however, and a little squall would have blown over, but for one unlucky word. "It's a scrape, I acknowledge, but if you will lend a hand, we'll pull through and have a good time yet. Don't cry, dear, but just exert yourself a bit and fix us up something to eat. We're both as hungry as hunters, so we shan't mind what it is. Give us the cold meat and bread and cheese. We won't ask for jelly." He meant it to be a good-natured joke, but that one word sealed his fate. Meg thought it was too cruel to hint about her sad failure, and the last atom of patience vanished as he spoke. "You must get yourself out of the scrape as you can. I'm too used up to exert myself for any more. It's like a man to propose a bone and fulgrim bread and cheese for company. I won't have anything of the sort in my house. Take that Scott up to Mother's, and tell him I'm away, sick, dead, anything. I won't see him, and you two can laugh at me and my jelly as much as you like. You won't have anything else here." And, having delivered her defiance all in one breath, Meg cast away her pinafore and precipitately left the field to bemoan herself in her own room. What those two creatures did in her absence, she never knew, but Mr. Scott was not taken up to Mother's, and when Meg descended, after they had strolled away together, she found traces of a promiscuous lunch, which filled her with horror. Lottie reported that they had eaten a much and greatly laughed, and the master bid her throw away all the sweet stuff and hide the pots. Meg longed to go and tell Mother, but a sense of shame at her own shortcomings of loyalty to John, who might be cruel, but nobody should know it, restrained her, and after summary cleaning up, she dressed herself prettily and sat down to wait for John to come and be forgiven. Unfortunately, John didn't come, not seeing the matter in that light. He carried it off as a good joke with Scott, excused his little wife as well as he could, and played the host so hospitably that his friend enjoyed the impromptu dinner and promised to come again. But John was angry, though he did not show it. He felt that Meg had deserted him in his hour of need. It wasn't fair to tell a man to bring folks home any time, with perfect freedom, and when he took you at your word, to flare up and blame him, and leave in the lurch, to be laughed at or pitied. No, by George, it wasn't, and Meg must know it. He had fumed inwardly during the feast, but when the flurry was over, and he strolled home after seeing Scott off, a milder mood came over him. Poor little thing, it was hard upon her when she tried so heartily to please me. She was wrong, of course, but then she was young. I must be patient and teach her. He hoped she didn't show him his duty. She longed to run to meet him and beg pardon and be kissed and comforted, as she was sure of being, but, of course, she did nothing of the sort, and when she saw John coming, began to hum quite naturally, as she rocked and sewed, like a lady of leisure in her best parlour. John was a little disappointed not to find a tender Niobe, but feeling that his dignity demanded the first apology, he made none, only came leisurely in and laid himself upon the sofa with the singularly relevant remark, "We are going to have a new moon, my dear." "I have no objection," was Meg's equally soothing remark. A few other topics of general interest were introduced by Mr. Brooke, and wet-blanketed by Mrs. Brooke, and conversation languished. John went to one window, unfolded his paper, and wrapped himself in it, figuratively speaking. Meg went to the other window, and sewed as if new rosettes for slippers were among the necessaries of life. Neither spoke. Both looked quite calm and firm, and both felt desperately uncomfortable. Oh dear, thought Meg, married life is very trying. It does need infinite patience, as well as love, as mother says. The word mother suggested that maternal counsels given long ago and received with unbelieving protests. John is a good man, but he has his faults, and you must learn to see and bear with them, remembering your own. He is very decided, but never will be obstinate, if you reason kindly, not oppose impatiently. He is very accurate and particular about the truth, a good trait, though you call him fussy. Never deceive him by look or word, Meg, and he will give you the confidence you deserve, the support you need. He has a temper not like ours, one flash and then all over, but the white, still anger that is seldom stirred, but once kindled is hard to quench. Be careful, be very careful, not to make his anger against yourself, for peace and happiness depend on keeping his respect. Watch yourself, be the first to ask pardon if you both err, and guard against the little piques, misunderstandings, and hasty words that often pave the way for bitter sorrow and regret. These words came back to Meg as she sat sewing in the sunset, especially the last. This was the first serious disagreement. Her own hasty speeches sounded both silly and unkind, as she recalled them. Her own anger looked childish now, and thoughts of poor John coming home to such a scene quite melted her heart. She glanced at him with tears in her eyes, but he did not see them. She put down her work and got up, thinking, "I will be the first to say, 'Forgive me,' but he did not seem to hear her. She went very slowly across the room, for pride was hard to swallow, and stood by him, but he did not turn his head. For a minute she felt as if she really couldn't do it. Then came the thought, "This is the beginning. I'll do my part, and have nothing to reproach myself with." And, stooping down, she softly kissed her husband on the forehead. Of course, that settled it. The penitent kiss was better world of words. And John had her on his knee in a minute, saying tenderly, "It was too bad to laugh at the poor little jelly pots. Forgive me, my dear. I never will again." But he did, oh bless you, yes, hundreds of times, and so did Meg, both declaring that it was the sweetest jelly they ever made, for family peace was preserved in that little family jar. After this, Meg had Mr. Scott to dinner by special invitation, and served him up a pleasant feast without a cooked wife for the first course, on which occasion she was so gay and gracious, and made everything go off so charmingly, that Mr. Scott told John he was a lucky fellow, and shook his head over the hardships of bachelorhood all the way home. In the autumn, new trials and experiences came to Meg. Sally Moffat renewed her friendship. She was always running out for a dish of gossip at the little house, or inviting that poor dear to come in and spend the day at the big house. It was pleasant, for in dull weather Meg often felt lonely. All were busy at home, John absent till night, and nothing to do but sew or read tells her about. So it naturally fell out that Meg got into the way of gating and gossiping with her friend. Seeing Sally's pretty things made her long for such, and pity herself because she had not got them. Sally was very kind, and often offered her the coveted trifles, but Meg declined them, knowing that John wouldn't like it. And then this foolish little woman went and did what John disliked even worse. She knew her husband's income, and she loved to feel that he trusted her, not only with his happiness, but with what some men seem to value more, his money. She knew where it was free to take what she liked, and all he asked was that she should keep account of every penny, pay bills once a month, and remember that she was a poor man's wife. Till now she had done well, been prudent and exact, kept her little account books neatly, and showed them to him monthly without fear. But that autumn the serpent got into Meg's paradise, and tempted her like many a modern Eve, not with apples, but with dress. Meg didn't like to be pitied and made to feel poor. It irritated her, but she was ashamed to confess it, and now and then she tried to console herself by buying something pretty, so that Sally needn't think she had to economize. She always felt wicked after it, for the pretty things were seldom necessaries, but then they cost so little, it wasn't worth worrying about. So the trifles increased unconsciously, and in the shopping excursions she was no longer a passive looker-on. But the trifles cost more than one would imagine, and when she glanced up her accounts at the end of the month, the sum total rather scared her. John was busy that month and left the bills to her. The next month he was absent, but the third he had a grand quarterly settling up, and Meg never forgot it. A few days before she had done a dreadful thing, and it weighed upon her conscience. Sally had been buying silks, and Meg longed for a new one, just a handsome, light one for parties. Her black silk was so common, and the thin things for evening wear were only proper for girls. Aunt March usually gave the sisters a present of $25 apiece at New Year. That was only a month to wait, and here was a lovely violet silk going at a bargain, and she had the money, if she only dared to take it. John always said what was his was hers, but would he think it right to spend not only the prospective 25, but another 25 out of the household fund? That was the question. Sally had urged her to do it, had offered to lend the money, and, with the best intentions in life, had tempted Meg beyond her strength. In an evil moment, the shopman held up the lovely shimmering folds, and said, "A bargain, I assure you, ma'am." She answered, "I'll take it," and it was cut off and paid for, and Sally had exulted, and she had laughed as if it were a thing of no consequence, and driven away, feeling as if she had stolen something, and the police were after her. When she got home, she tried to assuage the pangs of remorse by spreading forth the lovely silk, but it looked less silvery now. Didn't become her, after all, and the words $50 seemed stamped like a pattern down upon each breadth. She put it away, but it haunted her, not delightfully as a new dress should, but dreadfully, like the ghost of a folly that was not easily laid. When John got out his books that night, Meg's heart sank, and for the first time in her married life, she was afraid of her husband. The kind brown eyes looked as if they could be stern, and though he was unusually merry, she fancied that he had found her out, but didn't mean to let her know it. The house bills were all paid, the books all in order. John had praised her, and was undoing the old pocket book, which they called the bank, when Meg, knowing that it was quite empty, stopped his hand, saying nervously, "You haven't seen my private expense book yet." John never asked to see it, but she always insisted on his doing so, and used to enjoy his masculine amazement at the queer things women wanted, and made him guess what piping was, demand fiercely the meaning of a hug-me-tight, or wonder how a little thing composed of 3 rows rosebuds, a bit of velvet, and a pair of strings could possibly be upon it, and cost $6. That night he looked as if he would like the fun of quizzing her figures and pretending to be horrified at her extravagance, as he often did, being particularly proud of his prudent wife. The little book was brought slowly out and laid down before him. Meg got behind his chair under pretence of smoothing the wrinkles out of his tired forehead, and standing there, she said, with her panic increasing with every word, "John dear, I'm ashamed to show you my book, for I've really been dreadfully extravagant lately. I go about so much I must have things, you know, and Sally advised my getting it, so I did, and with New Year's money will partly pay for it. But I was sorry after I had done it, for I knew you'd think wrong of me." John laughed and threw her round beside him, saying good-humouredly, "Don't go and hide. I won't beat you if you have got a pair of killing boots. I'm rather proud of my wife's feet, and don't mind if she does pay $8 or $9 for her boots, if they are good ones." That had been one of her last trifles, and John's eyes had fallen out as he spoke. "Oh, what will he say when he comes to that awful $50, thought Meg with a shiver. "It's worse than boots. It's a silk dress," she said, with the calmness of desperation, for she wanted the worst over. "Well, dear, what is the demmed total, as Mr. Mantalini says?" That didn't sound like John, and she knew he was looking up at her with the straightforward look that she had been ready to meet and answer with one as frank till now. She turned the page, and her head at the same time, pointing to the sum, which had been bad enough without the 50, but which was appalling to her with that added. For a minute the room was very still. Then John said slowly, but she could feel it cost him an effort to express no displeasure, "Well, I don't know that 50 is much for a dress, with all the furbelows and notions you have to finish it off these days." "It isn't made or trimmed," sighed Meg, faintly, for a sudden recollection of the cost still to be incurred quite overwhelmed her. 25 yards of silk seems a good deal to cover one small woman, but I've no doubt my wife will look as fine as Ned Moffat's when she gets it done," said John dryly. "I know you are angry, John, but I can't help it. I don't mean to waste your money, and I didn't think those little things would count up so. I can't resist them when I see Sally buying all she wants and pitying me because I don't. I try to be contented, but it is hard, and I'm tired of being poor." The last words were spoken so low she thought he did not hear them, but he did, and they wounded him deeply, for he had denied himself many pleasures for Meg's sake. She could have bitten her tongue out the minute she had said it, for John pushed the books away and got up, saying with a little quiver in his voice, "I was afraid of this. I do my best, Meg." If he had scolded her, or even shaken her, it would not have broken her heart like those few words. She ran to him and held him close, crying with repentant tears, "Oh, John, my dear, kind, hard-working boy, I didn't mean it. It was so wicked, so untrue and ungrateful. How could I say it? Oh, how could I say it?" He was very kind, forgave it readily, and did not utter one reproach. But Meg knew that she had done and said a thing which would not be forgotten soon, though he might never allude to it again. She had promised to love him for better or worse, and then she, his wife, had reproached him with his poverty after spending his earnings recklessly. It was dreadful, and the worst of it was John went on so quietly afterward, just as if nothing had happened, except that he stayed in town later and worked at night when she had gone to cry herself to sleep. A week of remorse nearly made Meg sick, and the discovery that John had countermanded the order of his new greatcoat reduced her to a state of despair which was pathetic to behold. He had simply said, in answer to her surprised inquiries as to the change, "I can't afford it, my dear." Meg said no more, but a few minutes after he had found her he found her in the hall with her face buried in the old great coat, crying as if her heart would break. They had a long talk that night, and Meg learned to love her husband better for his poverty, because it seemed to have made a man of him, given him the strength and courage to fight his own way, and taught him a tender patience with which to bear and comfort the natural longings and failures of those he loved. Next day, she put her pride in her pocket, went to Sally, told the truth, and asked her to buy the silk as a favour. The good-natured Mrs. Moffat willingly did so, and had the delicacy not to make her a present of it immediately afterward. Then Meg ordered home the great coat, and when John arrived, she put it on and asked him how he liked her new silk gown. One can imagine what answer he made, how he received his present, and what a blissful state of things ensued. John came home early. Meg gaited no more, and that great coat was put on in the morning by a very happy husband, and taken off at night by a most devoted little wife. So the year rolled round, and at midsummer there came to Meg a new experience, the deepest and tenderest of a woman's life. Laurie came sneaking into the kitchen of the Dovecote one Saturday with an excited face, and was received with a clash of cymbals, for Hannah clapped her hands with the saucepan in one and the other, and the cover of the other. How's the little mama? Where is everybody? Why didn't you tell me before I came home? Began Laurie in a loud whisper. Happy as a queen, the dear. Every soul of 'em is upstairs a-worshipping. We didn't want no hurricanes round. Now, you go into the parlour, and I'll send them down to you. With which somewhat involved reply, Hannah vanished, chuckling ecstatically. Presently Joe appeared, proudly bearing a flannel bundle laid forth upon a large pillow. Joe's face was very sober, but her eyes twinkled, and there was an odd sound in her voice of repressed emotions of some sort. Shut your eyes and hold out your arms, she said invitingly. Laurie backed precipitately into a corner and put his hands behind him with an imploring gesture. No, thank you, I'd rather not. I'll drop it or smash it, as sure as fate. Then you shan't see your nevy, said Joe decidedly, turning as if to go. I will. Only you must be responsible for damages. And obeying orders, Laurie heroically shut his eyes, while something was put into his arms. A peal of laughter from Joe, Amy, Mrs. March, Hannah, and John caused him to open them the next minute, to find himself invested with 2 babies instead of 1. No wonder they laughed, for the expression of his face was droll enough to convulse a Quaker, as he stood and stared wildly from the unconscious innocence to the hilarious spectators with such dismay that Joe sat down on the floor and screamed. Twins! By Jupiter! Was all he said for a minute, then turned to the women with an appealing look that was comically piteous. He added, Take 'em quick, somebody. I'm going to laugh, and I shall drop 'em. Joe rescued his babies, and marched up and down with one on each arm, as if already initiated into the mysteries of baby tending, while Laurie laughed till the tears ran down his cheeks. It's the best joke of the season, isn't it? I wouldn't have told you, for I set my heart on surprising you, and I flatter myself I've done it, said Joe, when she got her breath. I never was more staggered in my life. Isn't it fun? Are they boys? What are you going to name them? Let's have another look. Hold me up, Joe, for upon my life it's one too many for me, returned Laurie, regarding the infants with the air of a big, benevolent Newfoundland, looking at a pair of infantile kittens. Boy and girl, aren't they beauties? Said the proud papa, beaming upon the little red squirmers as if they were unfledged angels. Most remarkable children I ever saw. Which is which? And Laurie bent like a well sweep to examine the prodigies. Amy put a blue ribbon on the boy and a pink on the girl, French fashion, so you can always tell. Besides, one has blue eyes and one brown. Kiss them, Uncle Ted. usual timidity in such matters. Of course they will. They're used to it now. Do it this minute, sir, commanded Joe, fearing he might propose a proxy. Laurie screwed up his face and obeyed, with a gingerly peck at each little cheek, then produced another laugh and made the babies squeal. There, I knew they didn't like it. That's the boy. See him kick. He hits out with his fists like a good one. Now then, young Brooke, pitch into a man of your own size, will you? Cried Laurie, delighted with a poke in the face from a tiny fist flapping aimlessly about. He is to be named John Lawrence, and the girl Margaret, after mother and grandmother. We shall call her Daisy, so as not to have two Megs, and I suppose the Manny will be Jack, unless we find a better name, said Amy, with aunt-like interest. Name him Demi-John, and call him Demi for short, said Laurie. Daisy and Demi, just the thing. I knew Teddy would do it, cried Jo, clapping her hands. Teddy certainly had done it that time, for the babies were Daisy and Demi to the end of the chapter. Chapter 6. Calls. Come, Jo, it's time. For what? You don't mean to say you have forgotten that you promised to make half a dozen calls with me today? I've done a good many rash and foolish things in my life, but I don't think I ever was mad enough to say I'd make 6 calls in one day when a single one upsets me for a week. Yes, you did. It was a bargain between us. I was to finish the crayon for Beth for you, and you were to go properly with me and return our neighbours' visits. If it was fair, that was in the bond, and I stand to the letter of my bond. Shylock. There is a pile of clouds in the east. It is not fair, and I don't go. Now that's shirking. It's a lovely day, no prospect of rain, and you pride yourself on keeping promises. To be so honourable, come and do your duty, and then be at peace for another 6 months. At that minute, Jo was particularly absorbed in dressmaking, for she was a mantua maker, general to the family, and took especial credit to herself, because she could use a needle as well as a pen. It was very provoking to be arrested in the act of a first trying on, and ordered out to make calls in her best array on a warm July day. She hated calls of the formal sort, and never made any till Amy compelled her with a bargain, bribe, or promise. In the present instance, there was no escape, and, having clashed her scissors rebelliously while protesting that she smelt thunder, she gave in, put away her work, and, taking up her hat and gloves with an air of resignation, told Amy the victim was ready. Jo March, you are perverse enough to provoke a saint. You don't intend to make calls in that state, I hope, cried Amy, surveying her with amazement. Why not? I'm neat and cool and comfortable, quite proper for a dusty walk on a warm day. If people care more for my clothes than you do for me, I don't wish to see them. You can dress for both and be as elegant as you please. It pays for you to be fine. It doesn't for me, and for pillows will only worry me. Oh dear, sighed Amy. Now she's in a contrary fit, and will drive me distracted before I can get her properly ready. I'm sure it's no pleasure to me to go today, but it's debt we owe society, and there's no one to pay it but you and me. I'll do anything for you, Jo, if you'll only dress yourself nicely, and come and help me do the civil. You can talk so well, look so aristocratic in your best things, and behave so beautifully if you try, that I'm proud of you. I'm afraid to go alone. Do come and take care of me. You're an artful little puss to flatter and wheedle your cross old sister in that way. The idea of my being aristocratic and well-bred, and your being afraid to go anywhere alone. I don't know which is the most absurd, nose in your bonnet. It's becoming, and you look too sober in your plain suit. Take your light gloves and the embroidered handkerchief. We'll stop at Meg's and borrow her white sunshade, and then you can have my dove-coloured ones. While Aunt Amy dressed, she issued her orders, and Jo obeyed them, not without entering her protest, however, for she sighed as she rustled into her new organdie, frowned darkly at herself as she tied her bonnet strings in an irreproachable bow, wrestled viciously with pins as she put on her collar, wrinkled up her features generally as she shook out the handkerchief, whose embroidery was as irritating to her nose as the present mission was to her feelings. And when she had squeezed her hands into tight gloves with 3 buttons and a tassel as the last touch of elegance, she turned to Amy with an imbecile expression of countenance, saying meekly, "I'm perfectly miserable. If you consider me presentable, I die happy." "You're highly satisfactory. Turn slowly and let me get a careful view." Jo revolved, and Amy gave a touch there and here and there, then fell back with her head on one side, observing graciously, "Yes, you'll do. Your head is all I could ask, for that white bonnet with the rose is quite ravishing. Hold back your shoulders and carry your hands easily, no matter if your gloves do pinch. There is one thing you can do well, Jo, that is, wear a shawl. I can't, but it's very nice to see you, and I'm so glad Aunt Marcia gave you that lovely one. It's simple but handsome, and those folds over the arm are really artistic. Is the point of my mantle in the middle, and have I looped my dress evenly? I like to show my boots, for my feet are pretty, though my nose isn't. You are a thing of beauty and a joy forever," said Jo, looking through her hand with the air of a connoisseur at the blue feather against the golden hair. "Am I to drag my best dress through the dust, or loop it up, please, ma'am? Hold it up when you walk, but drop it in the house. The sweeping style suits you best, and you must learn to trail your skirts gracefully. You haven't half-buttoned one cuff. Do it at once. You'll never look finished if you are not careful about the little details, for they make up the pleasing whole." Jo sighed and proceeded to burst the buttons of her glove in doing up her cuff, but at last both were ready and sailed away, looking as pretty as pictures, Hannah said as she hung out of the upper window to watch them. "Now, Jo dear, the Chesters consider themselves very elegant people, so I want you to put your best deportment on your best deportment. Don't make any of your abrupt remarks, or do anything odd, will you? Just be calm, cool, and quiet. That's safe and ladylike, and you can easily do it for 15 minutes, said Amy, as they approached the first place, having borrowed the white parasol and been inspected by Meg, with a baby on each arm. "Let me see. Calm, cool, and quiet. Yes, I think I can promise that. I played the part of a prim young lady on the stage, and I'll try it off. My powers are great, as you shall see, so be easy in your mind, my child." Amy looked relieved, but Naughty Jo took her at her word, for during the first call she sat with every limb gracefully composed, every fold correctly draped, calm as a summer sea, cool as a snowbank, and as silent as the Sphinx. In vain Mrs. Chester alluded to her charming novel, and the Mrs. Chesters introduced parties, picnics, the opera, and the fashions. Each and all were answered by a smile, a bow, and a demure yes or no, with the chill on. In vain Amy telegraphed the word talk, tried to draw her out, and administered covert pokes with her foot. Jo sat as if blandly unconscious of it all, with deportment like Maud's face, icily regular, splendidly null. "What a haughty, uninteresting creature that oldest Miss March is," was the unfortunately audible remark properly dignified and composed, and you made yourself a perfect stock and stone. Try to be sociable at the Lambs. Gossip as other girls do, and be interested in dress and flirtations, and whatever nonsense comes up. They move in the best society, are valuable persons for us to know, and I wouldn't fail to make a good impression there for anything. I'll be agreeable, I'll gossip and giggle, and have horrors and raptures over any trifle you like. I rather enjoy this, and now I'll imitate what is called a charming girl. I can do it, for I have May Chester as a model, and I'll improve upon her. See if the Lambs don't say, what a lovely, nice creature that Jo March is. Amy felt anxious, as well she might, for when Jo turned freakish, there was no knowing where she would stop. Amy's face was a study when she saw her sister skim into the next drawing room, kiss all the young ladies with effusion, beam graciously upon the young gentlemen, and join the chat with a spirit which amazed the beholder. Amy was taken possession of by Mrs. Lamb, with whom she was a favourite, and forced to hear a long account of Lucretia's last attack, while three delightful young gentlemen hovered near, waiting for a pause when they might rush in and rescue her. So situated, she was powerless to check Jo, who seemed possessed by a spirit of mischief, and talked away as volubly as the lady. A knot of heads gathered about her, and Amy strained her ears to hear what was going on, for broken sentences filled her with curiosity, and the frequent peals of laughter made her wild to share the fun. One may imagine her suffering on overhearing fragments of this sort of conversation. She rides splendidly. Who taught her? No one. She used to practice mounting, holding the reins and sitting straight on an old saddle in a tree. Now she rides anything, for she doesn't know what fear is, and the stableman lets her have horses cheap because she trains them to carry ladies so well. She has such passion for it. I often tell her, if everything else fails, she can be a horse breaker and get her living so. At this awful speech, Amy contained herself with difficulty, for the impression was being given that she was rather a fast young lady, which was her special aversion. But what could she do? For the old lady was in the middle of her story, and long before it was done, Jo was off again, making more droll revelations and committing still more fearful blunders. Yes, Amy was in despair that day, for all the good beasts were gone, and of three left, one was lame, one blind, and the other so bulky that you had to put dirt in his mouth before he would start. Nice animal for a pleasure party, wasn't it? Which did she choose? Asked one of the laughing gentlemen who enjoyed the subject. None of them. She heard of a young horse at the farmhouse over the river, and though a lady had never ridden him, she resolved to try, because he was handsome and spirited. Her struggles were really pathetic. There was no one to bring the horse to the saddle, so she took the saddle to the horse. My dear creature, she actually rode it over the river, put it on her head, and marched up to the barn, to the utter amazement of the old man. Did she ride the horse? Of course she did, and had a capital time. I expected to see her brought home in fragments, but she managed him perfectly, and was the life of the party. Well, I call that plucky, and young Mr. Lamb turned an approving glance upon Amy, wondering what his mother could be saying to make the girl look so red and uncomfortable. She was still redder and more uncomfortable a moment after, when a sudden turn in the conversation introduced the subject of dress. One of the young ladies asked Jo where she got the pretty drab hat she wore to the picnic, and stupid Jo, instead of mentioning the place where it was bought 2 years ago, must needs answers with unnecessary frankness. Oh, Amy painted it. You can't buy those soft shades, so we paint ours any colour we like. It's a great comfort to have an artistic performances. There's nothing the child can't do. Why, she wanted a pair of blue boots for Sally's party, so she just painted her soiled white ones the loveliest shade of sky blue you ever saw, and they looked exactly like satin, added Jo, with an air of pride in her sister's accomplishments that exasperated Amy, till Sheila felt that it would be a relief to throw her card case at her. We read a story of yours the other day, and enjoyed it very much, observed the elder Miss Lamb, wishing to compliment the literary lady, who did not look the character just then, it must be confessed. Any mention of her works always had a bad effect upon Jo, who either grew rigid and looked offended, or changed the subject with a brusque remark, as now. Sorry you could find nothing better to read. I write that rubbish because it sells, and ordinary people like it. Are you going to New York this winter? As Miss Lamb had enjoyed the story, this speech was not exactly grateful or complimentary. The minute it was made, Jo saw her mistake, but, fearing to make the matter worse, suddenly remembered that it was for her to make the first move toward departure, and did so with an abruptness that left the three people with half-finished sentences in their mouths. Amy, we must go. Goodbye, dear. Do come and see us. We are pining for a visit. I don't dare to ask you, Mr. Lamb, but if you should come, I don't think I shall have the heart to send you away. Jo said this with such a droll imitation of May Chester's gushing style that Amy got out of the room as rapidly as possible, feeling a strong desire to laugh and cry at the same time. Didn't I do well? Asked Jo, with a satisfied air as they walked away. Nothing could have been worse, was Amy's crushing reply. What possessed you to tell those stories about my saddle, and the hats and boots and all the rest of it? Why, it's funny and amuses people. They know we are poor, so it's no use pretending that we have grooms, buy 3 or 4 hats a season, and have things as easy and fine as they do. You needn't go and tell them all our little shifts and expose our poverty in that perfectly unnecessary way. You haven't a bit of proper pride, and never will learn when to hold your tongue and when to speak, said Amy despairingly. Poor Jo looked abashed and silently chafed at the end of her nose with a stiff handkerchief, as if performing a penance for her misdemeanours. How shall I behave here? She asked as they approached the third manor. Just as you please. I wash my hands of you, was Amy's short answer. Then I'll enjoy myself. The boys are at home, and we'll have a comfortable time. Goodness knows I need a little change, for elegance has a bad effect upon my constitution, returned Jo, gruffly, being disturbed by her failure to suit. An enthusiastic welcome from 3 big boys and several pretty children speedily soothed her ruffled feelings, and, leaving Amy to entertain the hostess and Mr. Tudor, who happened to be calling likewise, Jo devoted herself to the young folks and found the change refreshing. She listened to college stories with deep interest, caressed pointers and poodles without a murmur, agreed heartily that Tom Brown was a brick, regardless of the improper form of praise, and when one lad proposed a visit to his turtle tank, she went with an alacrity which caused Mamma to smile upon her, as that motherly lady settled the cap, which was left in ruinous condition by filial hugs, bear-like but affectionate, and dearer to her than the most faultless coiffure from the hands of an inspired Frenchwoman. Leaving her sister to her own devices, Amy proceeded to enjoy herself to her heart's content. Mr. Tudor's uncle had married an English lady who was third cousin to a living lord, and Amy regarded the whole family with great respect, for, in spite of her American birth and breeding, she possessed that reverence for titles which haunts the best of us, that unacknowledged loyalty to the early faith in kings, which set the most democratic nation under the sun in ferment at the coming of a royal yellow-haired laddie, some years ago, and which still has something to do with the love of the young country, bears the old, like that of a big son, for an imperious little mother, who held him while she could, and let him go with a farewell scolding when he rebelled. But even the satisfaction of talking with a distant connection of the British nobility did not render Amy forgetful of time, and when a proper number of minutes had passed, she reluctantly tore herself from this aristocratic society, and looked about for Joe, fervently hoping that her incorrigible sister would not be found in any position which should bring disgrace upon the name of March. It might have been worse, but Amy considered it bad, for Joe sat on the grass with an encampment of boys about her, and a dirty-footed dog reposing on the skirt of her state and festival dress, as she related one of Laurie's pranks to her admiring audience. One small child was poking turtles with Amy's cherished parasol, and the second was eating gingerbread over Joe's best bonnet, and a third playing ball with her gloves. But all were enjoying themselves, and when Joe collected her damaged property to go, her escort accompanied her, begging her to come again. It was such fun to hear about Laurie's larks. Capital boys, aren't they? I feel quite young and brisk again after that, said Joe, strolling along with her hands behind her, partly from habit, partly to conceal the bespattered parasol. Why do you always avoid Mr. Tudor? Asked Amy, wisely refraining from any comment upon Joe's dissipated appearance. Don't like him. He puts on airs, snubs his sisters, worries his father, and doesn't speak respectfully of his mother. Laurie says he's fast, and I don't consider him a desirable acquaintance, so I let him alone. You might treat him civilly at least. You gave him a cool nod, and just now you bowed and smiled in the politest way to Tommy Chamberlain, whose father keeps a grocery store. If you had just reversed the nod and the bow, it would have been great, right? Said Amy reprovingly. No, it wouldn't, returned reverse Joe. I neither like, respect, nor admire Tudor, though his grandfather's uncle's nephew's niece was a third cousin to a lord. Tommy is poor and bashful, and good and very clever. I think well of him, and like to show that I do, for he is a gentleman, in spite of the brown paper parcels. It's no use trying to argue with you, began Amy. Not the least, my dear, interrupted Joe. So, let us look amiable and drop a card here, as the kings are evidently out, for which I'm deeply grateful. The family card case having done its duty, the girls walked on, and Joe uttered another thanksgiving on reaching the 5th house and being told that the young ladies were engaged. Now, let us go home and never mind Aunt March today. We can run down there any time, and it's really a pity to trail through the dust in our best bibs and tuckers when we are tired and cross. Speak for yourself, if you please. Aunt March likes to have us pay her the compliment of coming in style and making a formal call. It's a little thing to do, but it gives her pleasure, and I don't believe it will hurt your things half so much as letting dirty dogs and clumping boys spoil them. Stoop down and let me take the crumbs off your bonnet. What a good girl you are, Amy, said Joe, with a repentant glance from her own damaged costume to that of her sister, which was fresh and spotless still. I wish it was as easy for me to do little things to please people as it is for you. I think of them, but it takes too much time to do them, so I wait for a chance to confer a great favour and let the small ones slip. But they tell best in the end, I fancy. Amy smiled and was mollified at once, saying with a maternal air, Women should learn to be agreeable, particularly poor ones, for they have no other way of repaying the kindness they receive. If you'd remember that and practice it, you'd be better liked than I am, because there is more of you. I'm a crotchety old thing, and I always shall be, but I'm willing to own that you are right. Only it's easier for me to risk my life for a person than to be pleasant to him when fortune to have such strong likes and dislikes, isn't it? It's a greater not to be able to hide them. I don't mind saying that I don't approve of Tudor any more than you do, but I'm not called upon to tell him so. Neither are you, and there is no use in making yourself disagreeable because he is. But I think girls ought to show when they disapprove of young men, and how can they do it except by their manners? Preaching does not do any good, as I know to my sorrow, since I've had Teddy to manage. But there are many little ways in which I can influence him without a word, and I say we ought to do it to others if we can. Teddy is a remarkable boy, and can't be taken as a sample of other boys, said Amy, in a tone of solemn conviction, which would have convulsed the remarkable boy if he had heard it. If we were pals, or women of wealth and position, we might do something, perhaps, but for us to frown at one set of young gentlemen because we don't approve of them, and smile upon another set because we do, wouldn't have a particle of effect, and we should only be considered odd and puritanical. So we are to countenance things and people which we detest, merely because we are not pals and millionaires, are we? That's a nice sort of morality. I can't argue about it. I only know that it's the way of the world, and people who set themselves against it only get laughed at for their pains. I don't like reformers, and I hope you never try to be one. I do like them, and I shall be one if I can, for, in spite of the laughing, the world would never get on without them. We can't agree about that, for you belong to the old set, and I to the new. You will get on the best, but I shall have the liveliest time of it. I should rather enjoy the brickbats and hooting, I think. Well, compose yourself now, and don't worry Aunt with your new ideas. I'll try not to, but I'm always possessed to burst out with some particularly blunt speech or revolutionary sentiment before her. It's my doom, and I can't help it. They found Aunt Carol with the old lady, both absorbed in some very interesting subject, but they dropped it as the girls came in, with a conscious look which betrayed that they had been talking about their nieces. Joe was not in a good humour, and the perverse fit returned, but Amy, who had virtuously done her duty, kept her temper, and pleased everybody, was in a most angelic frame of mind. This amiable spirit was felt at once, and both aunts my-deared her affectionately, looking what they afterwards said emphatically, "The child improves every day." "Are you going to help about the fair, dear?" asked Mrs. Carroll, as Amy sat down beside her with the confiding air elderly people like so well in the young. "Yes, Aunt. Mrs. Chester asked me if I would, and I offered to tend the table, as I have nothing but my time to give." "I'm not," put in Joe decidedly. "I hate to be patronized, and the Chesters think it's a great favor to allow us to help with their highly connected affair." "I wonder you consented, Amy. They only want you to work." "I am willing to work. It's for the freedmen, as well as the Chesters, and I think it very kind of them to let me share the labour and the fun. Patronage does not trouble me when it is well meant." "Quite right and proper. I like your grateful spirit, my dear. It's a pleasure to help people who appreciate our efforts. Some do not, and that is trying," observed Aunt March, looking over her spectacles at Jo, who sat apart, rocking herself with a somewhat morose expression. If Jo had only known what a great happiness was wavering in the balance for one of them, she would have turned dove-like in a minute. But, unfortunately, we don't have windows in our breasts, and cannot see what goes on in the minds of our friends. Better for us that we cannot, as a general thing, but now and then it would be such a comfort, such a saving of time and temper. By her next speech, Jo deprived herself of several years of pleasure, and received a timely lesson in the art of holding her tongue. said Aunt March, with a decided nod to Aunt Carol. Mercifully unconscious of what she had done, Jo sat with her nose in the air, and a revolutionary aspect, which was anything but inviting. "Do you speak French, dear?" asked Mrs. Carroll, laying a hand on Amy's. "Pretty well, thanks to Aunt March, who lets Esther talk to me as often as I like," replied Amy, with a grateful look, which caused the old lady to smile affably. "How are you about the languages?" asked Mrs. Carroll of Jo. "Don't know a word. I'm very stupid about studying anything. Can't bear French. It's such a slippery, silly sort of language," was the brusque reply. Another look passed between the ladies, and Aunt March said to Amy, "You are quite strong and well now, dear, I believe. Eyes don't trouble you any more, do they?" "Not at all, thank you, ma'am. I'm very well and mean to do great things next winter, so that I may be ready for Rome whenever that joyful time arrives." "Good girl. You deserve to go, and I'm sure you will some day," said Aunt March, with an approving pat on the head as Amy picked up her ball for her. "Crosspatch, draw the latch, sit by the fire and spill," squalled Polly, bending down from his perch on the back of her chair to peep into Jo's face with such a comical air of impertinent inquiry that it was impossible to help laughing. "Most observing bird," said the old lady. "Come and take a walk, my dear," cried Polly, hopping toward the china closet with a look suggestive of a lump of sugar. "Thank you, I will. Come, Amy." And Jo brought the visit to an end, feeling more strongly than ever that calls did have a bad effect upon her constitution. She shook hands in a gentlemanly manner, but Amy kissed both the aunts, and the girls departed, leaving behind them the impression of shadow and sunshine, which impression caused Aunt March to say, as they vanished, "You'd better do it, Mary. I'll supply the money." And Aunt Carol to reply decidedly, "I certainly will, if her father